The last minute sleepers you need on your fantasy playoff roster. We're going to talk about that on today's show. We are talking about the FFPC playoff contest. We've done some shows earlier this week looking at the AFC, the NFC, kind of giving some of our thoughts on who we think will advance deep into the playoffs and then ultimately win the Super Bowl. Shawn and Ben did some content over on Stadium Bananas looking at it as well. The 3 Stadium Bananas shows this week, so make sure you check those out if you haven't already. Listening over the weekend. Some fantastic stuff from the 2 guys on that one. Shawn, we're going to talk some sleepers, some of the players that are projected to be lower owned as we advance into this. I think there's some very, very interesting names, but I'm starting to get pretty hyped up as we get closer and closer. We are recording this Friday. We are recording a little bit later in the week than we normally do, but the Packers play on Sunday, and they lose to the Bears last week. Shawn, I come in to do our kind of shows on Monday, and I'm like, oh my goodness, everything's wrong. But as the week progresses, Shawn, you're in the playoffs. It's time to get excited. If you're not excited now, when can you get excited? But the Packers and the Eagles, I'm pretty excited about that. There's some very interesting matches and some players that we really like just in general to see how their kind of story, how their season plays out now over the next couple of weeks. This is just an awesome time of the year for the best teams in the NFL left in action. So how are you feeling ahead of this wild card weekend? I mentioned on, I think it was the Monday show, it's like, I don't know if it's a wild card, I don't know if it's super wild card, I don't know what they're calling it now. I did see, Shawn, over the last few days that the NFL have they no longer call it super wild card weekend. Obviously the branding mustn't have took effect, so we're back to the regular old wild card weekend.
Well, what we need to have are a bunch of additional play-in teams, so no one's even sure what round we are in. Colm, yes, as you mentioned, excitement. It's been so much fun to work through the content. The 2025 RotoViz FFPC Playoff Challenge Guide is up on the site. That was one of my longest articles of the year. So much fun going through that, working through every team.
And just to interrupt you, for anyone that is playing in the contest, you may have listened to all the shows. You need to go and read Shawn's piece. I will link it in the show notes, but it covers everything in great detail, and we'll be talking about some of them today, but must read if you're going to play in the contest.
And obviously, just like any such article, I'm sure to get plenty of things wrong, but what I try and do is lay out a variety of options and help you weigh the different decisions for yourself. But you have the information, you have the key notes to plot out a course that works for you. So with that being said, Colm, we've done quite a bit of content on the challenge on the shows this week, but there continue to be things that we haven't covered or that a little bit more detail will be interesting. Our thinking about the contest continues to evolve as we put together our own lineups, all of that type of thing. And we wanted to do a little bit of a show today on sleepers with the caveat that you don't necessarily need to get that crazy. One of the things that's fun about the Playoff 2 contest next week, which is also one of our favorites, is that once you have a bunch of teams eliminated, you do need to very specifically look at the teams you build in that version to make sure that this combination of uniqueness and coherent story works together. In this version, where you have the 14 teams, you have the 12 players that you pick, and basically the 2 teams that you fully fade. I mean, that's just as much an actual play in this contest as the other 12. You don't have to get that crazy. That was one of the notes that Ben really tried to hammer home during our Stealing Bananas shows. But you have to be aware that the highest roster players are going to be on other people's teams, and think through what that means for you. And as you go through, you can do something as simple as play quarterbacks who are likely to be on very few rosters. One of the things about this specific contest is that because the Bills and the Ravens are so good, and because their quarterbacks, if they make the Super Bowl, will play in 4 games, and because of who the other players on their teams are, it will actually be very difficult for one of those 2 QBs to not be the winner. And so on the one hand, you're like, well, you should play the winner. On the other hand, if you don't want to play one of those two players, then already your lineup becomes pretty unique. And so you don't necessarily want to take a bunch of additional detours beyond that. Having said that, and kind of made that the foundation, Colm, where do you want to start in terms of looking at guys who do count as sleepers for this contest and yet have the potential to really go off and create that big score for you?
Yeah, so the interesting thing, just to highlight it to the people listening, Shawn mentioned the QBs, and Lamar Jackson and Josh Allen expected to be the most rostered quarterbacks. Probably in the range of 80% of the teams will have one of those two guys on it. Then it would be Jalen Hurts, but everyone else is going to be sub 10%. So like even a player like going with if you like the Eagles, going with Jalen Hurts, there's a quarterback Shawn I really like, somebody we really like is Jayden Daniels, and he probably is going to be in the 5% or lower range. So having somebody like him on your roster immediately makes it very unique. So looking at the higher roster players, there's going to be like Saquon Barkley, Travis Kelce, Puka Nacua, Justin Jefferson. People will be fading the Denver Broncos fully. Lad McConkey, Pittsburgh Steelers, fade for if they go out. There's a lot of players that are going to be at the high end. But the player that I find, Shawn, the most interesting, that really I think has a chance to go off based on how I think the playoffs are going to go, and I know this is something that maybe Shawn doesn't fully agree with, I'm expecting the Commanders to take the Bucs this week, and that leads to them getting at least 2 games. And what we've seen from Jayden Daniels recently, I think we move him into a high category with 2+ games. And I do think that then, unless they're in a situation, I'm hoping the Packers can upset the Eagles. Shawn, if the Packers would upset the Eagles, and something that you highlight in the article and you did with Ben earlier this week is like, paint that picture or tell that story. And if you go in and you work through some playoff predictions and the playoff predictors, there's some good websites and apps for it. But if you change it around and the Packers were to win, that leads to, the team like the Commanders then playing the winner of the Eagles and sorry, not the Eagles, the LA Rams and the Vikings. And that opens up the door for them then to possibly get, another game into the NFC Championship. So he's somebody, Shawn, at low percentages, even though he may end up being the 4th or 5th highest quarterback rostered. I think just being that different to the Allen or Lamar teams, I think that he is the player that I'm most interested that's sub 10% so far. I know you love Jayden Daniels. Are you not seeing my painted picture of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers crashing out this week and seeing a potential NFC Championship run here for Daniels?
The different caliber of schedules makes for an interesting evaluation of some of the various teams. Now, most of what we are seeing does suggest that the Bucs are a middle of the road playoff team, and the Commanders are one of the weakest teams. The Bucs have been so dominant in this most recent run that they have really good metrics on both the offensive and defensive sides of the ball. One of the things that pops out if you take a look at the wrong read tool that Blair uses for his articles every week, and this is sort of an internal tool that we may release for next season. But if you pull that up, you look at it without week 18 considered, and you kind of have to do that just because so many of the teams are not taking that one seriously if you want to think through ranks and where everybody is. But the Bucs, when you look at this sort of last 6-week stretch, they have a pass defense that creates intense pressure while limiting separation and wiping out run after the catch. Their run defense stacks the box and ranks number 1 in yards per carry allowed and explosive plays. Their passing offense is top 5 in both yards per play and yards after catch over expected. Their rushing offense is top 3 in yards over expected, yards after contact, and explosive plays. You dive into some of the additional advanced stats for the full season, and you see that their run blocking grade is extremely high. It's one of the things that has allowed Bucky Irving to be so fantastic. Now, his individual metrics are also sensational. So when you put those two together, because SIS at least tries to control for the other pieces, but if your run blocking is dynamic, your back is electric, you're pretty good. And, Baker Mayfield has been aggressive. He's been willing to push the ball. You have over this last stretch, Jalen McMillan really exploding. And so he was one of the sleepers that I think is a little bit interesting. Again, you probably don't need to go to him, right? Your roster has a lot of easy ways to get unique enough without dropping that far down. But this is someone who is on a super hot streak over the last 5 games, and all that's heavily fueled by touchdowns. It's not exclusively so, right? He's got a 19% target share over this recent stretch where he's gone for 22, 18.5, 17, 23, and 19 points. My point here is basically that the Bucks could be very, very good, and I think that they are a threat to some of the contenders in a way that they're probably not getting credit for. The flip side of that is, as you mentioned, we love Jayden Daniels, and he would be interesting to play. The game level similarity projections have him as the number 1 quarterback this week. And I think especially when you look at things like the potential weather and the paths for Buffalo and Baltimore. Probably they blow out their opponents this week, but the Steelers have held Baltimore down previously, created some problems for their individual guys, and they're not going to have Zay Flowers this week, which makes them a little bit less dynamic. It puts more pressure on players like Rashad Bateman and Mark Andrews, who are good, but weren't superstars in the 2024 season by any stretch. You think through all of that, then you think through the matchup against each other. You think through the matchup potentially against Kansas City. You're talking about good defenses. You're talking about cold weather. That could make it challenging for them to put up the points that we're used to. Well, I mean, Jayden Daniels may be ready to sort of continue the stretch that we saw before the weirdness from week 18, the removal, the concerns that, maybe his leg isn't 100% healthy. As I'm thinking through it, I do think that when you have both of these QBs on the AFC side and the really strong likelihood that one of them is in the AFC Championship game, giving them at least 3 games. When you have Jalen Hurts on the NFC side and creating another option. Now, in the story that you've told, he gets upset. So we're a little bit less concerned about him. But Daniels probably has to play the 3 games. So you do need them, obviously, to win. And that helps because he probably has a good game in a win. I don't think that they can win if he doesn't play well. It's just the team is so reliant on
the
him.
The percentage of the team's offense is going to be through him. If they are they're not getting there with him not putting up numbers.
No, they're not. And so then if you do have that situation where they have the Vikings Rams winner, I mean, that's a good matchup as well. And certainly, especially against the Vikings, they would not be favored, but I think you can win that game. And then you go play at Detroit in the Dome against a defense that doesn't have all his guys. And even in a loss, he could put up a massive game. If you get the 3 games, then he can do it. You don't have to have him in the Super Bowl, especially if the Super Bowl is Lions-Chiefs. So looking at it from that perspective, I do think it's interesting. I don't think he's going to be on almost any rosters, and so you create a ton of leverage. You are playing a pretty unlikely path, but in trying to win, the $500,000, you're going to need some things to break right for you. There are a lot stranger things that folks are going to bet on than simply the Commanders winning 2 games.
Yeah, and if we look back to last season, for example, Packers last year going to play the Cowboys. Cowboys expected to win that one. The Packers start off quick and beat them. They almost then, and probably in my opinion, should have bet the 49ers. The door can open very, very quickly, and the direction can change in terms of expectations very swiftly. And for somebody who's a mobile quarterback, that's what you want to see. The other quarterback I will mention, Shawn, we won't go into him, but Patrick Mahomes likely to be very low roster because you can only have one player from each team. Travis Kelce is going to be probably on almost 2/3 to 3/4 of the rosters. Then we'll have some Xavier Worthy around 10 to 15%, the kicker, and then we're going to have Patrick Mahomes. So there is the opportunity there. You're looking at, you make the case in the article for him playing in the Super Bowl. You get the double points in the Super Bowl. Very, very interesting path if we're making that story of the Chiefs continuing their dominance. The team I want to make sure that we head on, because there's a couple of names that are very interesting, is the Detroit Lions. They're not going to play this week, but you've locked in your lineups. We're expecting them, as Shawn mentioned there, to potentially likely get to the Super Bowl. So you have Jahmyr Gibbs, who's going to be on probably 50% or more of the rosters. You've Amon-Ra St. Brown, probably on a third, around that range of the rosters. Then you get Sam LaPorta, Jameson Williams, Jared Goff. The player that I'm intrigued by, they're all probably going the sub 5%. Sam LaPorta in a tight end premium format where the tight end is so valuable. If you do not go the direction of Travis Kelce, Sam LaPorta is obviously very interesting with a lot more volume going his way in recent weeks. But Shawn, David Montgomery working his way back from this injury versus, Jahmyr Gibbs. Montgomery likely to be possibly less than 1% rostered, but certainly less than 5% rostered. May not be involved instantly, but there's a chance that he's healthy and active for next week's games to get some of the goal line work, perhaps. Is he somebody that we should be wary of as, likely being on the Jahmyr Gibbs side and getting him into those lineups? And then how do you feel about the likes of LaPorta or Williams? Because for teams expected to get to the Super Bowl and then potentially the double points, like for example, if Montgomery's 70% of what he has been in the season next week, and then we get another week for the conference game and he's around that same, but then you get to the Super Bowl and he's back to 100% and you get double points. How are you kind of working through the Lions here? Because I think they have a few players based on their potential to get to the Super Bowl that I think can certainly be classed as sleepers, and then they obviously have the superstars at the top as well.
Yeah, I don't think that you can play David Montgomery, even though he averaged 16 points per game this season. And if he hits on touchdowns, he's going to score a lot of running back points, especially if he scores the key moments in the Super Bowl, right? One of the things that I worked through in the article, almost as just an aside, because you could argue that it isn't that relevant, but just the splits with and without Montgomery and how shockingly better the Detroit offense was in all of the individual players outside of Amon-Ra St. Brown, which in some ways is surprising, in some ways is maybe not, since St. Brown has such a high floor of volume baked in, even when they have all of these other weapons going. My thought there is that a team who just watched that happen, a team that knows they don't have the defensive strength that they had for the majority of the season when they wanted to go with Montgomery as both an opener and a closer and a guy who was a bit of a change of pace back in the middle of the game. Now, one of the things that happens when you do that is that you simply lose the potential for plays because the clock is going to run on all of those. And you're going to lose the explosiveness that you get when those are changed out for targets to Jameson Williams and targets to Sam LaPorta. My thesis is that the Lions will play him less, even if he's pretty close to fully healthy. That doesn't mean they won't play him at all. Right? I don't think that Jahmyr Gibbs has the same ceiling that he demonstrated when Montgomery was out. And a little bit of that is just,
they still did work some of the other guys in, though, too. He's not going to have 100% of the touches anyway.
Right. But we're talking about a guy who scored 16 points per game during the regular season. I mean, that's, and not that you're saying it is, but that's not worked in. I mean, he's just sucking a huge amount of volume out of the game. The Lions are interesting because they score so many points, and that has ramifications for whether or not you can realistically play Jared Goff, but also how you think about playing these other guys. Jameson Williams is one of my absolute favorites he did have a fantastic year. He had a big week 17, but he very obviously doesn't have the target volume, even in this stretch where he got going in the second half of the season after his suspension. He doesn't have the volume to really be playable, right? So if you were to play Williams, you're going to play him in a situation probably where they get the Vikings in that second round and they get upset, which is very reasonable. But that would be where you would play him. I think that the interesting play, and this was sort of the case last year with Travis Kelce, where Patrick Mahomes had a very good Super Bowl, and yet Travis Kelce was the play because he scored so many points in a game that was doubled, and that made his relationship to other tight ends, combined with the other quarterback options you had and just the way that your overall team then slots in. Again, we have 1 QB, 2 running back, 2 wide receiver, 1 tight end, and 4 flexes with the kicker and the defense. You had to have Kelce. I think this LaPorta could be that guy. It's really easy to miss how good he was over the second half of the year because he was so disappointing in the first half and because he never had one of those games that was so massive where you sit back and like, okay, well, Sam LaPorta is back. He had 3 20-point games, though, when we look at the premium scoring. Since week 8, he was the overall tight end 6. Since week 13, he was the overall tight end 4. He was very consistent across that time period. Again, he probably gets hurt by David Montgomery coming back, but my pitch would be, to the Lions. If Dan Campbell is out there listening to RotoViz Overtime, would be use your stars. And my thesis for how to play this contest is that the Lions will lean into that a little bit more, even though they love David Montgomery, and that Sam LaPorta is going to be such a big star during the 2024 playoffs that, his ADP obviously is going to fall a little bit going into next season, but he's going to be a trendy player yet again next year.
Moving into some wide receivers, Shawn, and I'm going to pair some of these together and you can pick your favorite or work through them. But some wide receivers that kind of stand out to me at their projected volume are, I mentioned, the fade of Denver. Probably 2/3 of the team are going to completely hard fade the Denver Broncos. You have talked earlier this week about, they're more live in this Buffalo game than maybe people are giving them credit for. Somebody who has had a hot streak, when we're talking about some of the players we mentioned already, Marvin Mims, probably because of the amount of people who will fade the team, will not be factored in. Sub 5% certainly, possibly even sub 1% off the lineups will have him mixed in. He obviously had a really strong finish, as I mentioned there. The other ones that you can play off each other, I think even in a potential from behind script, he could be factored in the way they started to use him recently, but it is a narrower path. But then obviously if there's an upset, that would change the picture of the whole contest dramatically. I'm not expecting the Bills to be upset by the Broncos, but I think it could be closer than people were expecting. But the Packers play the Eagles. Devonta Smith, Shawn, with the likely ownership for Saquon Barkley being the highest roster player in the contest, he'll probably be sub 5% as well. And then on the other side, somebody who we've been frustrated at his usage throughout the year, and I've joked with you that maybe they're saving it all for the playoffs. I don't necessarily think that is the case, but there is no Christian Watson, unfortunately, with his knee injury. Jayden Reed, though, Shawn, in an even lower percentage, he's probably going to be in that Marvin Mims category where people are either frustrated with how his season went or think that the Packers are going to lose, so there will be a fade on him. But both of those in that same contest. But the other player that I'm really interested in this one, obviously, if Justin Jefferson's going to be on a high percentage, probably 2/3 of the rosters, but his running mate at wide receiver and Jordan Addison, sub 10%, probably in the 5% range. I think all 4 of those wide receivers are intriguing. I think Addison and Smith are the 2 most intriguing. But I think then on games where there's maybe more scoring or they're closer, or if the Packers were to go on and upset the Eagles, I think that Mims and Reed could be interesting. They're in a lower tier for me. But Addison and Smith, Shawn, for me, are certainly pivot plays off very high roster players in Barkley and also Justin Jefferson, but that could have similar scoring in either game script that those games play out, and then hoping to have multiple contests from them as well.
Yeah, so the couple names that really jump out in the game level similarity projections are Courtland Sutton and Jordan Addison. Sutton is a guy that it just doesn't get me excited. He's sort of an air yards and touchdown play, and those can be very good plays. He doesn't do anything with the ball in his hands. Marvin Mims is so much fun. The Broncos offense has somehow been a lot of fun. I mean, somehow it's Bo Nix, right? Despite not getting what we would have thought we really had to have from Troy Franklin in order for the passing offense to go, because otherwise there's just not much talent there. Now, the emergence of Mims does create a dynamic where with Sutton and Mims, and then if you get a little bit from Vele, if you get even a couple of catches from Franklin, if you get something from the running backs in the passing game, then it works, especially when Nix is probably going to add decent yardage as a rusher. We know that he's almost certainly not viable in the contest, but playing a Broncos player as opposed to having them as a full fade, again, I'm not saying it's definitely going to work, but it just seems like one of the easiest ways that you can create some uniqueness and also just get a lot of points. Courtland Sutton has the third highest ceiling outcome for the week in the GLSP. Part of that is because he has been very good recently, but also because Buffalo has been shredded by a lot of these top receivers in a game that has a lot more shootout potential probably than people realize. The other one and Sutton does have a very low floor projected by GLSP as well. So you're certainly onboarding some risk with that. Jordan Addison, the fifth best ceiling. He doesn't project as well as Justin Jefferson, but the projections are so close. I mean, the projections from a lot of other people are not going to be as close. But one of the things that I do want to emphasize, and the reason that GLSP has him at that level, is that, I mean, he has been a scoring machine, right? You look at Addison, and even with 2 games in this week 10 to week 18 stretch, 2 games under 5, he's averaged 16.3. From week 9 to 17, and again, trying to pull these games where the player has emerged and is over the second half of the season to give you a sense of, and the reason that the week 17 is the cutoff there and not week 18, where granted he did do very poorly, is just to try and create apples and oranges with so many of the players who didn't play at all. But Addison was number 5 in air yards the entire NFL and trailed only Jamar Chase in the touchdown department. When you get that opportunity and when you can put that many potential points onto your roster and also then create a roster where you're just instantly very unique, I think that is the way to play this. I mean, you want to create sort of floor and ceiling. One of the things that you would love to do is, even if you don't end up with the perfect scenario that wins the contest, I mean, you'd love to finish in a range where you make money off of it. And adding a lot of points while creating a roster that probably won't be duplicated is the way to do that, right? You can accomplish all of those objectives at the same time. And one of the things that I like about the Addison play that probably doesn't work as well for the Devonta Smith play is simply that, I mean, Addison has been so potent. You're fine if the Vikings win. This doesn't have to be like play Addison in a loss. You can play Addison and they go forward, because he has the potential to put a 25-point game, a 30-point game, and a 17-point game together. And yeah, I mean, Justin Jefferson could still outscore that. He could still be the guy you had to have, but there's no guarantee of that, right? Jefferson has been knocked down by both the way Sam Darnold has played and by Addison's emergence. He's still scoring a ton. right? Beginning in week 10, he averaged 17.8 points per game. That's a huge number for almost anybody. It's a mediocre number for Jefferson himself. He had 5 performances in that span that were wide receiver 3 or worse. So like the wide receiver 3 tier, that 25 through 36 area. So that or lower. You're not necessarily getting consistency if you get Justin Jefferson. You're not necessarily getting the guy you had to have over multiple weeks the way that you might in a lot of different scenarios. If you didn't have Addison, or you simply had a QB who could consistently get Jefferson the ball, I think that's a play you at least have to consider on some rosters.
So we've gone through some of the people or some of the names that we think are the most interesting that'll likely be low owned. Shawn, is there any names that we haven't touched on that you think could be interesting? I've mentioned the Jayden Daniels play. On the other side of that, making and painting that picture, painting that story. Tampa Bay, we have Bucky Irving, we have Mike Evans. There's lots of options. Well, not lots, but there's 2 very consistently rostered options that there's going to be. But to fade the Buccaneers completely, for example, if you think that they're going to lose to Washington, they're likely to be, that would be quite contrarian in terms of a low percentage. Because when you're thinking of the percentages for the players, you also have to think about the percentages for the fades. Denver and Pittsburgh going to be the most faded by quite some way. But any players or tactics that we haven't mentioned that you think could be interesting to getting a little bit different, not a huge detriment to your roster?
Well, Blair has a great article up that looks at this from a slightly different angle and is trying to help you create the optimal lineup using the screener to generate some very straightforward projections, just using the scores that the players have put up and what that historically then projects them out to. One of the things that we see in his lineups, and one of the things that GLSP also very strongly recommended when you think about what their projections for the wild card week are, and then what that means as you think through the future, is that you want to probably be very wide receiver heavy if you're looking to get the most points. Now, one thing about that is that that's not going to necessarily be an unusual way to play it, even in the season of the running back. When people actually go through their projections, they're going to see it as pretty wide receiver heavy. So if you do like additional running backs and you play a running back heavy lineup, that will probably be fairly unique. At the same time, some of the guys that I'm seeing consistently in Blair's lineup that I think you can get away from, and that he does then get away from as he works through different permutations of the contest where this team wins or that team wins, and you're starting to actually build out a story where your roster is coherent based on who you actually do have winning and losing. Nico Collins, Terry McLaurin, those are guys that I think you can go in a different direction on. I think that you can, one of the sort of weird things about Washington is I think you can full fade them even if you think that they played pretty well in that game, just the way that the scoring could actually come out. I talk a bit in the article about Zacchaeus, what his recent scoring has been relative to McLaurin, what the PMO says about McLaurin's matchup. You work through some of the things with Nico Collins. I don't think anybody is going to push back on the idea that the Texans are certainly a potential fade option that would work out well for you. When you kind of work that back around, Mike Evans is the guy in the Bucs lineup who ends up in these optimal lineups. And yet, when you think about the potential for down games or down tournaments for Saquon Barkley and Derrick Henry, I would note that if Justice Hill is healthy and plays, he probably does more damage to Derrick Henry than David Montgomery does to Jahmyr Gibbs. Now, it's not even necessarily exactly more damage, but that if both of those guys are out, then Gibbs is so far ahead of Henry that, he's a must-play guy. Henry is still very viable, but there are other ways that you could do that, the most obvious one still being Lamar Jackson. But if they're both in, even if Montgomery takes more points away from Gibbs, the fact that Gibbs just starts so much higher. Derrick Henry, if you put Justice Hill into a meaningful role in the game, which certainly could happen if, well, with Zay Flowers being out, then suddenly there's a ton of risk for Henry. And that's one of the reasons I do think the contest ends up being probably a Josh Allen with a Mark Andrews, or it ends up being simply a Lamar Jackson play because of that dynamic. I guess I don't see Derrick Henry as being very viable in this contest, even though he is here in many of the optimal lineups that Blair has put together. But if you take some of those guys out, then what you need to get from the running back position is best served by playing Bucky Irving. So that would be the kind of the final little thought in terms of how those different pieces interlock and what happens when you tell a coherent story. And again, maybe a story that is at least a tiny little bit RV tinged with some of our favorite guys in the lineup.
Yeah, so we put in the most favorite guys and build out our favorite scenarios. Shawn's still rooting for the double home team with the Chiefs versus the Lions in the Super Bowl to get, he can just relax and whoever wins. Shawn talked earlier this week about just giving the Lions a Super Bowl because the Chiefs had so many. So that's how gracious they're becoming in Kansas City at the moment. But that is going to wrap us up ahead of this playoff weekend. If you are playing in any of the playoff contests at the FFPC or elsewhere, best of luck. Hopefully your teams go the way you want. And if it is a case you're like me and you're rooting on the team that you support, hopefully the Packers can get a job done. But best wishes to your teams unless you support the Eagles as well. And that is going to be where we leave it on this edition of RotoViz OT. We will be back next week with more content. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter or Blue Sky at Overtime Ireland. You can check out all Shawn's work, including the massive piece on the contest that I will have linked in today's show notes up on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.